Great. So welcome everyone to really exciting code seminar. So today's speaker is Cecilia Rikap from University College London, where she's the head of research and an associate professor in economics at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And as you'll see on the slide, she's worked on many different topics, including AI and the cloud, and she'll be presenting some of our work. And then as usual, there'll also be time for Q&A afterwards. All right, so Cecilia, floor is yours. Welcome.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. I also know that you all have been working on related topics from a different perspective, and I think that this conversation is going to be definitely like very, very valuable for me, at least, and I hope it's also useful for you. I assuming that maybe you haven't heard before about this term intellectual monopolies, intellectual monopolization, which does not only fit for understanding the dynamics of the digital technologies or digital markets and ecosystems, but broadly, what I would say are the leading corporations of today's capitalism without considering the oil companies. I decided to start giving you a sort of like very brief introduction to what do we mean by intellectual monopolies with the different colleagues that I have been working with for this topic. And then I will move into the specifics of AI, the cloud, big tech, and so on and so forth. So going straight into the definition, when I should say two things. The first one is that in economics of innovation, we usually think that, of course, when there is a company that leapfrogs, that develops an innovation, that company will have an innovation or intellectual rent. And the idea is that it will last until someone else's leapfrogs or innovates anew, or until, if you want in more concrete terms, the patent expires and is easy to copy that company, or there is no, or imitation takes place even without patents or while the patent is still alive. And this leads sort of a temporary advantage of the innovator. However, what we are seeing more and more, particularly since the 21st century, but there are also cases during the 20th century, is that leading corporations have developed this capacity to be continuously monopolizing intangibles. And here I'm not only speaking of knowledge in all its forms, not only science or technologically based knowledge, but also experiential knowledge, but they're also capturing data and narratives, and they turn all this into their assets. So they use all these intangibles to capture value from you can say the ecosystems or the value chains, or what I would largely describe as spheres of control, including their ecosystems, global value chains, franchisees, and so on and so forth. So these are not one-time innovators. When we're speaking of an intellectual monopoly or a company with a capacity to exercise an intellectual monopoly, we're not saying this company had a hit, but it's more of continuous monopoly over the intangibles that precisely transforms this idea of the temporary advantage of the innovator into a sustained advantage. And this is why we can speak of permanent rentiers. It's not that the same intellectual rent lasts forever, or the intellectual rent that comes from monopolizing one piece of knowledge lasts forever, but that there is a continuous reinforcement of the entry barriers, a continuous reinforcement of the innovative advantage of the company, because there is this permanent process of even using the larger absorptive capacities, using the knowledge that has already been monopolized as an input for controlling, absorbing, and monopolizing even more knowledge and more intangibles at large. And they are proactive rentiers. When we make the comparison with landowners, they're not just sitting and waiting to cash the rent. They're actively investing in R&D. They're actively lobbying and trying to exercise regulatory capture, and all this requires investments. And they're also investing in corporate planning. And I will come back to this later on. They are investing in the information technologies that are needed to control these larger spheres that go beyond ownership. Two caveats before I move on are that, of course, this is different from a market monopoly. Actually, in many cases, for these companies, it's better not just to corner part of the competition, but to subordinate a great deal of that competition, to in a way exercise a form of corporate planning that not only controls the working process in the other companies, but also that shapes what the other companies are doing, where the other companies end up being placed inside either an ecosystem, a value chain, and so on and so forth. And the other caveat is that today's intellectual monopolies go way beyond the concentration of intellectual property rights. I'm not saying that the concentration of intellectual property rights doesn't matter. I'm saying that this is not the whole picture. And to give you just an insight on this, I am presenting here the list of the top 20, I think, or 25 organizations in terms of the number of AI granted patents that they got in 2022 following the WIPO's definition of what's an AI patent. And you can clearly see top 1, Toyota, top 2, Samsung, only top 3 is Alphabet. So Google, Microsoft, and Amazon are way below on the table. Meta is not even among these top 20 organizations. And this is not just because we got everything wrong and the big tech in the end of the day were not the ones that were at the forefront in profiting from AI, but this is because patents are telling us only a little part of the story, in particular in these technologies. But as I said before, it's not that intellectual monopolization is a new phenomenon, and it's not a phenomenon that only suits the digital industry. So to give a source of condensed view of the history and at the same time what I mean by intellectual monopolization, I am lately speaking of two phases of intellectual monopolization, taking into account how the leading corporation defines what the company will be doing in-house, and therefore what the priorities for acquisitions will be, and what is not so critical, and it can be outsourced and controlled anyway beyond ownership. Phase 1 is global value chains, basically, in its original format, which means that we had this simplified picture where the leading corporation kept the intangibles or kept the parts of the production process that were heavily driven by intangibles. So the R&D, the design, the marketing, and it outsourced the tangible part, the manufacturing. And this is why the resulting architecture could just be described as a global value chain. And as an example, we can think of the automobile industry and how the outsourcing and offshoring also of the industry took place already like by the last part of the 20th century. Also, we have the example of the old IBM, a company that actually was mostly can even be considered as an early intellectual monopoly. Also, automobile industry leaders, they can be considered as early intellectual monopolies. And in the case of IBM, basically, IBM in the past, when it was the queen of technology, it I wouldn't say all, but most of its intangibles were developed in-house inside IBM research in very big R&D laboratories, of course, taking insight from universities, but it was more of a sort of linear model of innovation where universities were advancing research, and then IBM was looking at what they were doing and using it for its own research and for continuing more up towards the application of that research, and also developing fundamental research as well itself. What has changed since then? And now the phase 2 gets way more complicated because it's not as easy as to say intangibles inside the leading corporation, tangibles outside the leading corporation. Everything gets more messy. And the way I'm describing this today is by saying that there are key intangibles. So we cannot just think of intangibles as an homogeneous bucket of things. Every intangible actually is different from the other. These are the most heterogeneous things that we can produce. And there are some intangibles that are particularly relevant for corporate planning, for controlling beyond ownership. I'm thinking here of if you want, the networks of information systems. If you are a global value chain leader, you need to know who does what and how. You need to know who are the organizations that you are going to be outsourcing pieces of your production process. And for that, you need information technologies, you need data, and you need a way to process that data. So this is also part of the reason why AI, ultimately, digital technologies more largely, are becoming so important, not only in the tech sector, but also in every industry for leading corporations, wide and large. And there is also another key intangible, just to give you some examples of what I have in mind here, which is the capacity to recombine. With Richard, we were discussing about his research when I logged in, and he was telling me, okay, I'm working a lot on modularity, but then you need to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And leading corporations have the capacity to see the puzzle, even if it's not already fitted one piece with the other, and are the only ones that know who is doing what, who can do what. So get the access to all these pieces, can put them together and recombine them. So this is another key intangible for that will not be outsourced. This capacity to combine the modules and create on that basis new intangibles. Brands and are another example of a key intangible kept in-house, where and what it's outsourced. So there are different links of the production of intangibles that are outsourced, and this of course goes directly to the concept of ecosystems and the different types of ecosystems we see in the digital world, with, yes, of course, complementarities. Without the operating system, the apps cannot work, but also without apps, the operating system is not useful in the end of the day. However, there is a big difference in terms of concentrating the intangibles for that more infrastructural layer than developing one specific app, and I will come back to this later on. Also, steps of R&D processes, such as the basic research and also the research that is needed for discovering a new treatment, has been outsourced. Big pharma companies are overall no longer doing the R&D. They arrive later and concentrate the intangibles that are relevant for going from bench to bed. But still, they can control the whole R&D process. And this leads me to a concept that to some extent includes the idea of ecosystems, but goes a bit beyond it, which is the concept of corporate innovation systems. So the resulting architecture of way of organizing not only the production of different goods and services, but also the production of knowledge beyond ownership is not simply the dynamic described by an ecosystem, but what I would describe as a corporate innovation system. Why? Because I'm also including here all the outsourcing of the R&D that even takes place at universities, public research organizations, everything under the guidance, under the leading corporations as the one defining what the R&D priorities will be, and being also the leading corporation, the one that afterwards concentrates most of the associated rents. I discussed a lot about the intangibles and how part of it now is outsourced. Let me also say that one thing that was missed in the phase one was that in the simplified version, it seemed as if all the leading corporations were going to outsource all the tangible dimension of the production process. And this is definitely an oversimplified picture. Today, it's clear that there are certain tangibles that operate as what, together with Cedric Duran and Anna Bensusen, we describe as MICAs, means of information and knowledge appropriation. If your advantage is precisely to have granular, you're a big tech company in particular, with all the data and all the algorithms to analyze it, of course, you will also be investing in data centers, and you will be interested in the satellites, the undersea cables, to expand your control of all those intangibles. But this is not the only case of Amica. You can even think of the knowledge that is developed as process innovations. If your advantage as an intellectual monopoly are process innovations, you cannot outsource the manufacturing because your innovations take place precisely inside, like on the shop floor, in the manufacturing process. And this is what we see, for instance, with TSMC. So the whole decision of what takes place in-house and what is outsourced, it's much more sophisticated, and it ultimately depends on to what extent the leading corporation that will exercise an intellectual monopoly can still control beyond ownership if it outsources or if it relies on other organizations rather than doing things in-house. Just emphasizing on the concept of corporate innovation systems before I move to the second part of my presentation, which is about AI and the cloud. Basically, the way that Lundben and I describe the corporate innovation system is by emphasizing that intangibles in all its forms, science in particular, but it's wider for every form of intangible, they are co-produced. They are co-produced by many. It's at the system level, the interactions among or between the actors what result in new knowledge. But then what we see at the level of the corporate innovation system is a process of appropriation of this knowledge. And this appropriation sometimes leads to assetization or monetization. So not every piece of knowledge that is appropriated by a single organization or a few organizations, but not all of the organizations that participate in the system, not every piece of that knowledge that is appropriated will then be monetized. And this is why making this difference is relevant. And it also helps us when we are making the distinction between saying you can concentrate a lot of patents, but that still doesn't directly speak of your capacity to monetize that appropriated knowledge. But what we see, and there is another thing that it's not portrayed on this sort of like very simple design, which is that what is being produced, what type of questions are prioritized and what is left behind is also typically defined or results from the priorities of the leading corporation. So if we move to the AI stack and have all these concepts in mind, what I will show you with some empirics in the rest of my presentation is that Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Meta control not only data, we know that they have probably the world's largest and most diverse data sets, but they also control the AI knowledge networks, both at the level of AI research and AI coding. So to some extent, their corporate innovation systems are almost overlapping with the global innovation network in AI. But there is a difference, and this difference is the cloud, because AI is produced, is exchanged, and then it's consumed inside the cloud. And this is Meta's weak point. Meta can produce AI in its own data centers, but when it comes to selling its LLMs, or more than selling, to offering its LLMs, even if they are open source, it actually does that on, it cannot escape from offering them on Google, Amazon, and Microsoft's cloud. One could say that this describes a scenario where today's general purpose technology is being controlled by just a handful of companies, and we could add the Chinese ones, and I can then draw some parallels with what's happening in China and what is different, but I will leave that for the Q&A. But there is something more, because AI is not simply a new general purpose technology. Deep learning, deep neural networks, so I'm including here all forms of today's machine learning, not only generative AI, as you know, are algorithms that get better the more data they process. They can even be described as a means of production that appreciates the more it is used. And it's been described also as a method of invention. So if just a few companies are controlling the type of AI that we get and are the ones that are shaping the technology, the trajectory of the technology, and also harvesting most of the profits, this means that they are ultimately controlling a method of invention, and one that may become the mainstream in every single discipline. So no, I'm not speaking here of AI as a method of invention in terms of the digital world, but for almost every discipline, even in social sciences, we're more and more pushed to adopt AI. And just as an example of where this can lead us, I find the results of this paper that was published late last year particularly relevant, especially when it comes to how the scientists, in this case, working on new materials discovery, describe the impact that using AI has had on their work. Because of the type of AI that it's been adopted, they describe that 82% of the scientists report reduced satisfaction with their work due to decreased creativity and skill underutilization. If we think of this not from a psychological perspective, but more from an economics of innovation perspective, what we have is that, yes, we may increase productivity in terms of the number of materials that are discovered, but the role of these scientists was not just to discover new materials, it's also to ask questions that reshape and potentially change the paradigms. And if their skills are underutilized, we risk them losing their capacity to even ask questions beyond this paradigm. So the potential effect can be a downgrading of every other method, every other way of asking questions. And if those that are controlling this technology are only a few companies, the impact for society at large can be much wider, and we can already think of consequences, not only at the level of the economics and democracy, which is also an often described effect, but also really at the level of how humans in the world ask and answer questions and think about problems and solve problems. But before getting too much into this more, if you want, philosophical discussion, I want to give you some empirics of what I have just said. How does big tech control AI research? And what I have done was to analyze the network of the organizations that were more frequently presenting their research in the most important AI conferences in the world. And already before ChatGPT and all the hype that we are living today, you could see that between 2018 and 2020, the two key nodes, the central nodes of the network, are Alphabet here and Microsoft here. And Meta or Facebook was also quite central, but not as much as Microsoft or Alphabet. This centrality also has, for the case of Microsoft, a particularly relevant geopolitical angle, because most of the actors that are integrating these clusters, the red ones, I hope you can see my mouse pointing to the clusters, are Chinese actors. Universities, companies, whereas these clusters are mostly populated by the rest of the world. So what we are seeing here is that Microsoft's research in China, first of all, is extremely important. Maybe even if the people from Microsoft were not based in China, they have a lot of established collaborations with Chinese actors. And it is through Microsoft that we see a bridge connecting the AI research agenda, the AI research community, all together and making it a sort of global community. Microsoft, if you see, the red classes on the right hand side are quite detached from the other classes. And the key bridge, again, the key connection is Microsoft. One could still say, okay, these companies play a central role in the field. What's the problem there? If they are sharing the knowledge, if they are sharing what they are doing, and they have, of course, they are multinational corporations, they will be able to cooperate with many universities and so on and so forth. But as you may probably also know, there are some stats that say that only 15% of the AI papers disclose the code. So really, they're not using the conferences as a place where they are actually sharing what they are doing, but it's more a place where they are promoting their research, where they are showcasing what they have done without really giving full access to their models and technologies. And what is even worse, if you make a comparison, for instance, between the co-authored publications and the co-owned patents as a sort of indication of knowledge appropriation. So basically, what's the share of, in this case, Microsoft's scientific publications that have a co-author that was not from Microsoft, and what's the share of patents that have a co-owner that was not from Microsoft? You can clearly see an indication of knowledge predatory practices here, because almost 90% of Microsoft publications were co-authored with other organizations, whereas only 1% of the patents have co-owners that were not Microsoft. And in other parts of my research, I have also delved into the content of the publications and patents to show that they are basically referring to the same thing. And already by 2014, companies like big tech companies were focusing their research on AI. They were already working on this way before the hype. For the sake of time, I will not describe my research here. There is a question. Maybe I can take it now if you want.
Yeah, just a very quick clarification. So you use a Scopus for this, and then it's a network analysis of putting authors and yeah, like all these tons. And how do you source the number of patents here?
Yes, sure. So for this network, I use Scopus because Scopus has information of conferences. So I retrieved all the conference or the papers presented at the 14 largest AI conferences, and then after cleaning everything, I just ask the algorithm to create a network with the top 150 organizations, and and I looked at it over time. So I looked at how the network evolved from 2012 onwards. For this table over here, I retrieved a different sample of papers. I retrieved every publication, whether in these AI conferences or in other parts, from Microsoft. And this goes from 2012 to 2021 because it comes from another paper.
Sure. No, sorry. And you said
the
Microsoft
patents,
there. Good.
yeah. And
Great.
for the patents, I use Derwent Innovation, which is a sort of like compendium of patents from all the patent offices in the world. So that to have like the largest, data set of patents.
And have you looked into how this moved after, 2020, for example, because I
haven't. Actually, I haven't, because these were hundreds of thousands of publications to arrive to this, and it took me a long time. So when I finished this, I was already doing something somehow different that is also part of this same paper, which was fieldwork. So I complemented this research with what ended up being 112 interviews with AI scientists, AI engineers, R&D directors, and also people working on planning and more on the adoption side of digital technologies from 55 of the largest multinational corporations in the world, including big tech, but also many other companies. And I did that mostly in 2023, like late 2022 and 2023 and a bit of 2024. So I haven't done any update of this. I do know from the interviews that this openness to publish papers in conferences, in particular from Google, changed after ChatGPT. So it's from a research perspective, it's sad because this, for me, was a very good insight into the corporate innovation systems of these companies. Because, of course, when you go and look at the patents, it seems that they are not collaborating with anyone because they just keep the property of the patent. Whereas when you go and look at the network, something I don't have in this presentation, but in my research, I have done it for many, many companies, not only in the tech sector. When you just use all these publications and create a network with the company at the center of the organizations that are more frequently co-authoring papers with the company, you can see the relations that they have with other companies, often with other big tech companies. They co-author papers, and also, of course, with universities, public research organizations, and it's part of a proxy of the corporate innovation system. So when a company decides to publish less, for me, it's kind of losing a way to proxy its corporate innovation system. For instance, and just to like sum up and move on, Amazon here is not so important, not because Amazon is not doing AI research. It's a company decision, and this is why the fieldwork was so important for my research. It's a company decision that they are not presenting so many papers on AI conferences. And this is why, on the one hand side, their influence to the research agenda would be somehow lower than the influence of a Google or Microsoft, but still they have developed their own ways to persuade scholars. They have, just like the other companies, they hire scholars part-time. So they have what they describe as Amazon scholars in this case. And of course, these scholars have a non-disclosure agreement with, and they cannot share anything at all with the universities or anyone else outside the company, but at the same time use a lot the research that they are developing at the university for the company.
That's not surprising. They also, they don't attend any major conferences and policies as a company decision too. Yeah, no, great. Sorry, you just can't move on. This is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. I'm also taking the time to plug my computer because I was running out of battery. Okay, so and I can go back to this later on if you want, because this network is published at a review of international political economy paper, where I actually analyze what I describe as varieties of corporate innovation systems. So the different strategies among Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta to control the AI global innovation network through their corporate innovation system in different ways. As I was saying, I will skip the discussion about open source and how these companies, in particular Microsoft, Google, and Meta, are using open source as a way to set standards, to control also beyond ownership, and sell and strategically choose what pieces of their software will be put in open source so that they can create these ecosystems with many other startups, thousands of startups and other companies that ultimately become dependent on their technologies by and using the open source software as an entry point. But I will go very briefly to discuss a bit of my work on how they control AI startups and startups more widely. On the top of this slide, you have a table that lists the top 10 investors in the AI startup world by February 2024. And after doing a lot of research on like scientific publications and so on, I moved and started using the same methodology. So I also have a bunch of network analysis for corporate venture capital. Who are the main investors in corporate venture capital for startups in general and AI startups in particular? And these tables, in a way, summarize part of.
Where is that? Is only states, or where is that?
It's global. It's startups globally, and I take the data from Crunchbase. Crunchbase is a sort of like.
No, that's very clear. But to me, it's like most of them are in China, and I can't see any of the. It's just because they don't publish that probably on Crunchbase. So if you look at, the UNCTAD reports, so you see that 90% is concentrated among the states and China. So none of these VCs are there, right? So that's why, but probably it's because Crunchbase doesn't.
Crunchbase has little representation of startups in China. So Crunchbase lists the startups. So you get access to the information about the startups, including the top 5 investors of each startup. And it's using that data that I get these lists, or that I get the number of startups that have among their top 5 investors, let's say, a Google. So of course the data is limited because of the low representation of China and what's happening there. But even to some extent living aside China, although we do have some representation of what like, and you can clearly see here that both Tencent and Alibaba are quite active in funding startups, and there are many interesting
90%, I mean, between the States and China. So that's why, the rest are pretty non-represented.
Yes. But what is also relevant is that even when you look at other other companies like SAP and its corporate venture capital, most of the firms that are receiving SAP money, even if SAP is German, are US companies. So it just reinforces the fact that it's not just that the venture capital is based in the US or based in China, but also when they are based somewhere else, they still prefer investing in the US in general when they are Europeans and so on. And basically, just to say that although these companies their main business is certainly not to be a venture capitalist, they are ranked among the largest venture capitalists in the number of AI companies that they are investing in. And this is relevant not just as and not mainly as a financial investment, but as a way to do what someone at an interview described as a double dip. I will say this and I will go to Thomas' question. Double dip in the sense that they have a direct line to the CEO. They can influence the R&D that the startups are doing, just as it happened between Microsoft and OpenAI. And this is also a way to exercise a technological lock-in, because in particular for Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, even part of this money arrives as cloud credits. So it's never a wire transfer, it's a compute voucher or a voucher to use part of the cloud services of the hyperscaler. And once that credit is over, yet the company just needs to start paying, and the whole architecture of the startup will already be on that cloud. Thomas, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting data. I was not sure whether I'm reading the second table correctly. So I wonder, these different funders invest probably at somewhat different stages of the startup. So would the numbers look drastically different if we looked at US dollars invested rather than number of AI funded companies?
No, definitely. Actually, for instance, Google, Amazon, there is a figure that says that Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, when it comes to generative AI, invested 2/3 of all the money that was poured into the generative AI startups in 2024. So definitely, no, in 2023, I'm sorry. So definitely, if you look at the money invested, it will show much more concentration among Amazon, Microsoft, and Google in particular. But here, I'm not interested in the financial dimension, but in the control dimension. And this is why I'm interested in the number of companies that have among their top investors a Google, an Intel, et cetera, et cetera. Why? Because of what I'm explaining here on the side. The more companies you're investing in, the more you can influence the research, the more you can influence the trajectory of the technology. Even if a lot of money is put just in OpenAI or Anthropic, if we just get caught on the dynamic of the relationship between these, like the most prominent AI startups and the big tech, we will be missing that the mushrooming startup world is ultimately controlled beyond ownership by these companies. And this is what and this is why I'm interested more in the numbers than in the money that is put into the startups in particular, where it's true that if we want to go and do a more detailed analysis of the startups, we may need to at least separate two types of AI startups, the ones that are developing models and the ones that are applying the models to create specific applications. And also among the ones developing models, there is a clear distinction between a small group of startups like OpenAI and Anthropic and a few others and all the rest. So yes, absolutely. And that would be a very super interesting work to do. But in this case, I was more interested in this dynamics of control beyond ownership that I was describing before more generally. And in particular, where all this is going is to showcase the relevance of the cloud. And widely here, I love this. This came out at New York Times some time ago. It's already old data, but the yellows will be all the submarine cables controlled by big tech, and now they have even more. And I like this because it also shows that it's not just about the data centers, it's about the network and how they control it. And this is a way to also portray it, if you want, in a more like visual way. But let me emphasize a bit more on what I was already anticipating about the cloud, because the cloud, we know that it's a very concentrated market and that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have around 65% of the market. And generally, people think of the cloud just as infrastructure as a service, as a place where you consume the compute for training the model or for running the model. But for me, actually, we should challenge that more simplified definition, because the cloud is today the computing services supermarket. Every type of digital service can be purchased as a service on the cloud. Of course, because it's a supermarket, it's not just Google, Amazon, and Microsoft offering their own services. It also operates as an ecosystem with a lot of so-called partners that have a extreme subordinate position in terms of how the technologies need to be developed. Even Amazon defines and needs to authorize the increases in prices and has a whole protocol on how prices should be defined to, should be defined on its Amazon Web Services cloud marketplace. And all the services, except for those that are open source, are sold as black boxes. So we need to make this distinction between the use of a technology and the access to the technology, because everything that is rented on the cloud is used without access unless it's open source. And this reinforces and further entrenches this power relation between the the hyperscalers, so Google, Amazon, and Microsoft on the one hand, and all the companies that are even developing services that then are sold there, and at the same time become companies that will be purchasing services, because for the development of an application, you need to at the same time hire services on the cloud. And as I was anticipating before, AI is developed, exchanged, and consumed on their clouds. So it's not just a supermarket. It's not just a place where a marketplace, but it's also the production sphere and the consumption sphere. So the control reaches every level in the case of the whole, if you want, supply chain of digital technologies. And it is not easy to switch to other companies, because one could still say there are 3 companies, but as one of my interviews from Amazon was clearly saying it, they build stickiness. They build their software in a way that makes it even harder to interoperate, to go to other hyperscalers. And this is not just affecting startups when they are developing their digital services. This is also why I did all these interviews with large companies. This is also affecting every type of organization, because leading corporations, wide and large, have migrated and are migrating to the cloud. And it's also now affecting governments. The UK government, for instance, recently signed a 5-year agreement with Microsoft to, quote unquote, support the new era of digital transformation. This is a presentation by Satya Nadella to Microsoft UK employees celebrating this agreement. So basically, and to sum up and expand also a bit of what I have said so far, what I've been mostly describing is the capacity of Amazon, Google, and Microsoft to control beyond ownership on the basis of their control, not only of data centers and data, but also of the AI talent, and ultimately all this together through their clouds, seen as the space where AI is being produced. And this is why they have this capacity not only to develop their own AI foundation models, but also to control beyond ownership all the others that are developing models and applications. But this, if we really take as a sort of AI value chain perspective, we need to add into this picture the role of NVIDIA and TSMC. And here, for instance, let me show you very briefly some other data. This comes from SPLC, so one of like Bloomberg's data sets on supply chains, both for customers and the suppliers of leading corporations. You can get access to some info on how relevant these companies are to each other. And we can see that over the years, this table goes from 2019 to 2021, and this one is 2024. And the circles in blue are Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta, and this information is for NVIDIA. So basically what I'm showing you here is that both as a customer and for NVIDIA and NVIDIA as a supplier of Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, and Google, the relationship becomes tighter over the years. So they become closer. They are more relevant to each other. And what we are arguing with Joseph Baines from King's College in a paper that we are currently finishing is that this has led to what we describe as a network cartelization in the AI value chain, or if you want to, we can also use the term stack. So network cartelization in the AI stack, where companies that are formally in different markets, once we take a more ecosystemic view of or value chain view of AI, we can see that they are co-developing technology, that they are developing higher co-specialization of their technology that reinforces their respective positions of power and enables them to control networks of organizations that complete these larger value chains. I will leave this here, just saying that, of course, this opens a lot of space for debate in terms of policy, in particular, given the recent events in the US. And part of all that is what we have addressed with some colleagues in a report that is just a policy report. It's not a paper that we call Reclaiming Digital Sovereignty. And I invite you all to read. And yeah, and if you read it, discuss and send your critiques to us. Thank you.